You're now tuning in to Performotion Podcast, where we talk powerlifting and rehab with our coaches, guests, and exercise physiologists. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Roundtable. And last episode, we spoke about programming the squat. A lot of it was covering the heuristics, the things we look into before we start prescribing things into the program. And I think the similar thing's going to apply for bench press in the sense that we're not really changing the main variables, and we do look at the same sort of things. So just to recap, like leverages, gender, training age, how advanced someone's in the sport as well, and their overall recoverability. So using those 5 factors, we can kind of apply the same sort of thinking or principles into bench press, right? So I think what we could start to look at is a comparison of like how much we prescribe in bench press versus how much we prescribe in squat. That way, I think it gives us a good idea of like how does absolute load play a role? Because obviously most people squat more than they bench press, right? So how's that going to affect the program? So should be a good discussion on that. Provide some good examples.
Let's do Dave. Dave squats the same as he bench presses, and he's not on here, so we can talk smack.
He is also prepping for bench worlds, I believe. Put the US flag. So I was like, all right, it's good.
Yeah. Well, he's squatting the same as he benches, so he should be. But no, basically, I'll just tag on from there, Danny. If we look at like kind of comparing squat and bench, yes, obviously, with the bench press, it's a much smaller range of motion compared to, a squat or a deadlift. The bar's traveling a lot less, but then it's also across the board, no matter how strong you are, you're generally lifting a lot less load, right? So if we look at kind of frequency and then also kind of like volume in terms of set count of how many times people will bench compared to they squat, generally someone's going to be benching a lot more. I think if we look at like the bench, we could probably look at kind of arch height and then maybe training age as the main 2 variables we would look at in terms of, how much we were to prescribe someone off the bat, in terms of training age, like how often or how long they've been benching for and how much they've milked out at like a minimum effective dose. And then also with arch height in terms of just how far that bar's moving. So like, a high arch lifter, generally like a lighter weight male or female, is going to be handling a lot more sets, higher rep ranges, generally a lot more kind of frequency throughout the week. Also, most likely like higher intensity work too, so kind of across the board, just more benching in general compared to a longer range lifter, heavier weight male, heavier weight female, most likely a little bit less intensity and less set count across the whole week.
Yeah, I think let's dive into what it means for you to be benching more. So like in terms of using frequency, intensity, volume, and exercise selection, what does that look like in comparison to squat? So I think last week when we spoke about it, generally people can squat 1 to 3 times a week, especially for like the lighter lifters, more recoverable lifters. That 3 times is around the sweet spot, 2 to 3 times. Heavier weightlifters who do need that fatigue management, that 1 to 2 times. It's that second session really needing to be controlled generally, right? So I guess when we look at bench press, that number gets skewed up quite a lot higher. Like let's take, for example, if we're going to fix a couple things. So let's talk about training age, leverages, for example. Like let's say an individual we're looking at has been moderately training in terms of powerlifting for quite a while. Their leverages are nothing special. It's not super short arms. It's not super long range of motion. So if we're talking averages, I think people can get away with benching and trying to get progressive overload like 2 to 4 times a week. That's a rough average.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think outliers wise, like if you have really short arms and you're very well leveraged for bench, you have a really high arch. Um, it's pretty, or even myself personally, I've gotten up to 6 times of benching per week, right? So you can definitely bench much more frequently. And during those sessions, I think it's important that, um, given how often you're benching, it's really important to also break down what each session is for, right? Because in the last episode, we spoke about fatigue management. That was a really important thing. When high frequency comes into the mix, fatigue management also becomes really important as well, because you can't literally push 6 sessions a day, right? Um, but yeah, so that goes for frequency. We could talk about intensity and volume as well. And I just briefly touched on fatigue management, but how do you guys kind of try and fix those two things to assist with fatigue management?
I guess in terms of like volume and intensity, usually you'll have, depending on how many days that they're benching, usually what I will do is I'll either program like one primary day or I'll program 2 primary days, and then around those is where we'll kind of manipulate the intensity and the volume. So again, whether it's someone who can handle high frequency, or I guess they require higher frequency to progress, whereas someone who might be able to get away with, 3, 4 times, even 2 times benching with progress, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's just, yeah, I guess having those primary days as the higher intensity days. And then also just noting what they feel stronger with. Like, so say, for example, like someone might feel stronger with high intensity and lower volume, or someone else might feel stronger with higher volume but lower intensity. And it's just kind of manipulating both of these variables and just finding, I guess, the middle ground of where they feel they're strongest, because everyone's kind of going to be a bit different. But yeah, usually starting off with either what they have been doing in the past, and then using both of those two variables and manipulating them as you go along, as you're working with someone.
Yeah. So let's give an example, because I think it's really helpful to kind of illustrate this point. Let's try look at someone with like 2 times frequency versus someone who benches 5 days a week, right? So I think right off the bat, someone who's benching twice a week, and assuming they're both making progress, right? Like you kind of need to be a bit more careful with someone with higher frequency, just because since they're benching so often, and assuming they're somewhat recovering between each session, if you kind of push a session within the week that's not a priority, that can kind of throw off the rhythm of how you're recovering to prioritize performance. So you touched on, for example, like you might put a primary session, or you might even put 2 primary sessions, right? So if, let's say, for example, someone's got it at the start and the end of their week, pretty well spaced out, and then the middle of the week's kind of like to chill, to get work on technique without adding extra fatigue between those 2 days. I think that's a general nice layout, to think about, so that you can recover for these main sessions, right? But if in the middle of the week you're kind of like pushing some sort of variation that you're not necessarily meant to, um, yeah, that's where things can kind of derail when you are looking at someone who benches high frequency.
I guess that's where variations come in, as like they can be really important and really helpful to kind of cap the load on those non-primary days. So both like manipulating the intensity and the volume, but then using the variation to kind of load cap those days, so then the primaries feel stronger.
Yeah.
Like touching on that, like that layout that Danny just said, where like having primary days at the start and end of the week, and then the middle of the week sort of a little bit down, or like variations where you can work on tech, like that's pretty much Lucy's bench micro right now, and like she's been able to progress it significantly because it just works really well in the sense of cool, like day one, Monday, like she comes in fresh, she's got a heavy single, then she goes into reps, then she goes into like a long pause, and then another primary day at the end of the week. But then it always ends up being that obviously like that Friday or like day 4 primary day will still somewhat bleed or provide some sort of stimulus for Mondays. So she's always kind of just carrying this like stimulus, but like not fatigued obviously all the way through, which is once you can kind of find that kind of key layout for somebody, then you kind of know that's what they need essentially. And like the variations in a way, like Danny just said, like they're really good to keep stimulus but kind of control someone both from a load perspective, because they kind of can't really push it. And then I pretty much just keep RPE static the whole way through a block on those 2 middle days and like pretty much never change it. And I would say too, like that can be a big difference between, in my experience, like heavyweight lifters and then like lighter weight, in terms of the layout being, I would say like sometimes lighter weight lifters, because we can detrain a lot faster depending on whether that's like load on the bar and what we're lifting. Like we kind of need more days to kind of set ourselves up before a primary day, whereas heavier weights don't necessarily need that because they can put more load on the bar.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like, and when I mentioned that specific kind of layout where you've got like a front end loaded and back end loaded week, I'm also thinking of like variations of that as well and why that works, right? So I think if we're still using this same example, right, it's like you're maximizing the exposures enough so that you're getting like, you're trying to get 2 peak performances within the week, right? You're not spacing it in a way where it's like they're so closely packed together where it's like you come in and you do really well for one session, but you're under recovered for the next, right? So I'm thinking in terms of like principles, what we kind of look out for when we do look at high frequency training. And that's not to say that lower frequency is a bad thing. I just believe that if you have lower frequency training, it's easier to kind of lay out your training, because it's like you can space it wherever you want. There's a high degree of flexibility in comparison to high frequency, right? Because everyone kind of has the same 7 days. If you need to fit 4 or 5 days of training, there's very little room for like what days off you get, right, without impacting your recoverability. So the things we end up managing are, like you guys all mentioned, variations, how we manipulate volume, especially after those main sessions, as well as intensity as well. Cool.
Yeah,
It's
I
kind of
think
like
as well, like you go.
just real quick, it's kind of like just like layers, right? Like we layer on that kind of like bench prescription as you progress. So if we think of like having a base for someone being like, you know, that 2 times a week, someone earlier training age, the standard might be those 2 bench sessions. They're technically 2 primaries and they're both being pushed. And then when you layer on like these extra kind of days, you know, you might start with that middle day where it's quite lower intensity. It's a variation. You're just working on technique. Lakshya and I said the RP stays static. And then, you know, another layer from there would be, okay, you want to still like undulate up and down the rep scheme. So like the 4th day that you add in, you know, for someone down the track might be after at the end of the week, and then you might go back to more volume. So higher reps, lighter load. So you're just kind of having these like swings throughout the week where you're going up and down in intensity. And I think when you start to have a bench layout like that, you do get to see where someone like responds to. And then even like, so for example, like the 2 times a week, you know, primary days, if you're finding that, you know, someone is showing up quite well at the start of the week on the day 1, that could be even just feeding from that day 4 at the end of the week prior. So then you start to see, oh, okay, someone actually needs higher intensity or some heavy exposure to feel strong on bench. Or you might find that, you know, if you're running 3 times a week frequency, the end of the week single feels good, and that's because it's following a lighter intensity, lighter variation day in the middle of the week. So then you go, okay, you know, someone responds quite well to spacing them out and then having that variation. So you kind of just like with that bench layout, having the 2 singles is helpful because you get to see, you know, where someone's responding to in terms of, you know, volume and intensity. But then it also gives you options to kind of then manipulate the bench prescription to suit the lifter, whether that's 3 or 4 times. So obviously, like I said before, 2 times is always a good base to have because, you know, most likely you got freedom of training days. They're both going to be pushed. They're both most likely going to feel good. But, you know, in terms of over time, wanting to push progression, most likely might need to start pushing towards 3, maybe 4 times a week to, add volume across the whole week. And then, like you said, that's when you kind of get to play around with that bench layout a bit more in depth.
Yeah. A question that popped up in my head is like, when do you consider doing more on one day, given that you've got limited frequency, versus when do you just decide, let's add another day?
Yeah. Probably just like in terms of how they're probably recovering from like a muscle soreness sense. If they're kind of able to have both of those days kind of, progressing, or, pushing one day and they're still not like that sore on the other day. You can probably, assume that they can probably handle an extra day of benching, and then again, just starting on lower dose. But I think I would generally just look at kind of muscle soreness and overall recovery before I look at like adding any extra benching. Like if someone's just getting constantly sore in the chest and beat up just from those 2 days of benching, I would most likely just stay there and then start with adding a bit more on one of the days before progressing to that third.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
Oh,
I guess.
I was
Go
just gonna
for
say
it.
one thing too, like just off Sam. I would say I would also on that question look at like not only what their efficiency is in bench press, but like what fatigue bleeds from other lifts. So for me personally, just because of my own leverages, my bench gets taxed big time by squat and deadlift and like lower back fatigue. So for me personally, it's also a matter of like figuring out how my bench, like micro or my bench days, needs to be laid out in and around that too. Because if somebody's getting fatigue bleeding from other lifts as well, adding in another day might not be super beneficial, because if it's like before or after a squat or a deadlift and we know that their lower back gets really jacked up, like is that just gonna take away from them being able to like actually have an efficient bench press the next day? And does that mean that will they kind of really get anything out of it, and then will that take away from the enjoyment as well? Or is it better off just adding a little bit more to another day? That's a big thing that like I kind of take into consideration too.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely agree with that. I've found as well, like with low bar positioning. So, like, if someone's a really low bar, it's really going to bleed into, not bleed, but like it's going to affect their positioning on bench and how strong they feel with their shoulders if they're like beat up or not, which is something to consider as well. Just like you said, managing both the squat and the deadlift around the bench press. But it can become super individualized with bench programming, which can be kind of fun, like as the coach to program, just like finding where they feel strong.
Yeah, that's for me. To play devil's advocate and to provide another perspective. Generally, I don't really see too much of a bleed in when I like look at the span of like my whole roster, right? Like when I look at programming bench press, it's not so much in relation to squat and deadlift, but I do see how like it could have an effect, especially if like you do start pushing a lot of volume, a lot of intensity on squat or like deadlift as your first exercise of the day, and then you come into bench straight after that. That amount of fatigue could affect things. So it's like, I guess there comes a time where it's like you might need to put two primary like squat and bench together just for the sake of fitting everything in. But at the same time, I don't think like you need to look into it too much and just like overthink it as well, right? So for example, it's like, oh, I just squatted big. Now I'm gonna bench like, and it's gonna go to ruin without any sort of training data to back that, right? So
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it could definitely have an effect. That's not to say like it will never happen, but that effect could be slight. Like you might not even notice it, right?
I usually find that
Another
it's
question.
like
Oh, sorry.
like the following. Sorry, I usually find it's like the following day. So say for example for myself, I used to find I would bench like have a primary squat and then I would bench after, feel fine. But then it's the following day where you feel more beat up, which is probably the same as you, Shania. It's like that next day you feel, I guess, whether it's DOMS or like just general stiffness, which then in turn affects like how you can get into position for bench and then therefore like how strong you feel. So that was from that like positioning perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I would say like, and that comes down to like why like at times like you can program somebody 2 singles in 1 week, because it means that you can have a single on like, let's say if I use my program right now as an example, like I've got a primary SBD where it's like primary squat, back downs, primary bench, back downs, primary deadlift, back downs. And that Saturday bench just never progressed anywhere. And it was just purely from like a full week of fatigue of everything I've done in that week, then hitting a primary squat with X amount of back downs at X load and then trying to bench heavy. Just from a positional sense, there was just too much fatigue. And I did have a long pause on a Tuesday, which was just a bench and upper body day. And I just recently asked to swap it so that the long pause becomes Saturday, primary day becomes Tuesday. I've got done nothing beforehand, and I can now actually feel like I can push that single. So I think when you're programming it like that, like not only can you then monitor and see if there is actually something that is getting in the way of like, potentially a bench press single progressing, it does give you the ability to kind of just make that very easy swap in a sense of just like adjusting where the variation is and where the heavy single is, and then seeing how that progresses as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's move on from there, because I think we definitely covered in depth like what we think in terms of frequency, like what someone can get away with, and I guess the implications of when you do have high frequency as well. Covering volume, for our listeners, where do you guys kind of see the range of like how much is too much on one day versus like how much is, I guess, too little as well? Like, what's your range of what you've seen where someone can progress from in terms of sets of bench press in a given day?
Just going quick maths on the top of
Yeah.
my head.
Yeah. While everyone's thinking, I'll think of mine as well. I think me personally, and using my own leverages, like I've got short arms, really efficient bench press. There are days where I can get away with like 8 to 10 sets of bench press, right? Which
Yeah.
is very outside the range of like what's considered normal. But we also have trialed a lower set count on like those kind of primary days or days that we want to prioritize, where it's been like the traditional 3-4 sets a day, and sometimes that just hasn't progressed, right? So naturally, I think when we think of principles and like you want to progressively overload it and start from minimum effective dose, and if it doesn't work then you try more. But when I've gotten to the upper range for myself, someone who's super efficient, it can get to that 8 to 10 spot. But that's to say, like, not everyone's built short arms, high arch, right? So people can still get away with 2 to 3 sets of bench press on their main days if needed.
Yeah, I would say it would be probably I was gonna say 6 to 8 for like probably my roster right now, and I would say like that would probably be like like primary days or like the higher stress days is like 6 to 8 sets, and then probably like the lower stress days is anywhere from like 3 to 5 maybe. Like I would say like on a given range. So like obviously the higher stress days are the days that we want showing up. So they're the days that like are either like, primary singles or like a variation of a single or, with back downs. And then like the days in and around that are the days where I'll probably start with a little bit less and then manipulate depending on how the athlete's responding. So yeah, I would say anywhere from either like, 6 to 8 higher stress and then like 3 to 5 sets on the lower stress days.
Yeah, I'm similar. I
Yeah.
guess it's just looking at
Yeah.
like the minimum effective dose as well. So like rather than just going straight to a whole heap of sets, just start low and then you can always have room to be able to progress and build through the volume.
Yeah. I was thinking like you touched on minimum effective dose, and it's like you don't want to go straight to 8 to 10 sets like we're talking about, but like I think if within your circle or people you talk to or what you're used to seeing, if you're afraid to go beyond like 4 or 5 sets, I think that's why I asked the question. Like, if our listeners are like, what the hell, like 8 to 10 sets, but like they need it, that could provide a bit of like, hey, here's a sample size of like how much people go up to and see some progress out of it. and then that could provide some sort of confidence to try out something like that if that lower set count doesn't really work for them, or they've needed more but they're afraid to start adding more. Yeah, I think
really quick, sorry,
go
Danny.
for it.
Just like also like with like total set count, I cut out a bit there, so I missed like half what you were saying. But just to add in terms of like set count, like also just looking at again where someone's responding to, like what Leanne said before earlier on in the pod, like if someone responds to like higher intensity or lower intensity. So like if you find someone like on a higher stress day just needs like heavier exposure, like rather than having like a 4x3 or like a 3x4 back down, it might slowly progress into like a 5x2 or 6x2 or something like that. So like you're getting the same total rep count in that session, but they're just handling like a higher intensity with the doubles, so a bit closer to top end. So I think like not looking at set count just from like what they're doing, but just like also looking at like just if they need higher intensity or not, and factoring that in terms of how much you're prescribing on those higher stress days.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like I'm thinking you could definitely use that in a way to manage fatigue as well. Like 5x2 doesn't necessarily mean high intensity as well. It really depends on the priority and how you use it as a coach, right? Like I've had days where it's like you could put 3x2 and it's not necessarily there for high intensity. It's literally there just for practice, right? But at the same time, you could also go like 6x2 and I want you to push all these sets, right? So it really just depends. Yeah. Let's try close things out. We covered bench press specifically, how you can recover from it much quicker relative to like the main lifts, such as squat that we covered, and in our future episode we'll cover deadlifts. But how does that play into accessories as well? Like how many accessories you can add in, how frequent you can add in these sort of pressing accessories as well.
Should we touch on the client that always says that they're really beat up from doing tricep extensions the day before?
Yeah, like give us your take on that, Shana. I think like
I think there's a time and place. There's a time and place. But I think again, like personally in my experience, like I've had upper body accessories that are like all of my pressing movements that are done, I guess, the day before like a higher stress bench day, which is like fine. Like I wouldn't personally say I notice a difference. I would say having a lot of pressing volume the day before a higher stress day or primary day can set you up as well positionally. It can it can aid in that sort of setup or setup phase. But I've also had my primary pressing movements like on the same day as a primary day and a high stress day, and it's the same. I think because bench press is like, if we talk like it is a movement that the muscle is smaller, so recoverability is higher compared to that of squat and deadlift. Recoverability is like probably more hours rather than potentially a few days. But I say there's a time and a place in a sense of like, where are you at in competition prep? Like, what is the goal of the block? Like, what does the coach want, from you right now? Like, are you X amount of blocks out from a competition that it's all just about like getting stronger and building muscle while you still can and pushing everything to RPE 10 if you want? Or do we kind of need to dial back, and the accessory movements are mainly in there now just to restore any sort of like loss of range of motion, movement deficiencies, things like that when you are in a comp prep? I think that is the biggest question that it comes down to with upper body accessories, or just any accessory, to be fair, too.
This is a good note that kind of following on from that, Shania, that Jason just kind of told me the other week when I was having one of my periodic sooks about how bench press is just struggling. He basically reiterated the same thing to me, right? He's like, at this phase of training, close to competition, the goal is to, obviously bench press and maximize, and control what you're doing on bench press alone, not so much just adding fucking dumbbell press because you think it's just going to help increase, your 1RM bench. Like there's a time and place outside of competition to push more of these accessories. But the way he kind of explained it to me is that like just looking at, for me, like my recoverability in terms of, for bench not being my stronger lift, I just need to make sure I'm hitting like good attempts on the platform and like just keeping bench moving at a nice steady rate and not trying to force it too hard, because once you start forcing it too hard by trying to add all these accessories and push overall volume up in the whole week, that's when there's a high risk of like injuries, strains, whatever else that could diminish what you're going to get on that platform anyway. So like just looking at how much accessories you're doing, when you're doing them in terms of your overall phase of training, and having like a time and place for pushing them and not. But to segue off that, like most of my kind of roster would be like that middle to heavier weight males. So like, I would program kind of pressing accessories outside of their primary bench sessions. So like, if they're benching on a day one primary session, higher stress, I would generally put like their pressing accessories on like a day 2 or a day 3 away from that, just to kind of control the recovery throughout the whole week.
Yeah, and that kind of substitutes for someone who's like not doing high frequency training, right? Like that whole upper body session then becomes that third kind of frequency day. That's not actually benching, right? Kind of sits like that in my mind. I guess for me, like when we look at upper body accessories, we could definitely handle a lot more. You can do a lot more compound based movements. So I think like dumbbell press, machine press. You can even get away with like shoulder press as well. But like you can definitely do a lot more of those in comparison to something like hack squat, leg press, where you might only be able to handle it once or twice a week. But you can sprinkle like dumbbell bench, incline, chest press, weighted dips, like 3 to 4 days in the week if you really need to. It's not, but it's like, I would say you don't have to be afraid of training upper body more frequently, including the accessory work as well. You could probably do some sort of upper body work within every single day of training if need be, I find.
Well, I think too, like, it's a matter of like the upper body stuff, like you can put in, like when a client isn't in like a direct competition prep, it's like feeding them more upper body accessories, and then like that's going to obviously accumulate more fatigue, right? And then it's the easy transition of then when it does come into a comp prep, like you'll take out a set here or there, or you'll adjust the RPE, and then it's like that communication of like what we kind of need these accessories in there for now.
Yeah,
just like
I
don't
agree.
be afraid to push them. Like at the end of the day, you're going to get stronger, and then it's going to carry into the platform. So just go ham on it. Like go look at Begsy's Instagram and watch her doing her tricep extensions. Like go do that and you will get stronger. Like it doesn't have to be that complex. Like yes, there's so many things that we can do as a coach, but then as an athlete, it's like just go and train hard, and I promise you will get stronger.
Yeah, I love that.
Yep.
I think for me, like,
fuck yeah.
From an athlete perspective, when I go into the gym, like literally all I think is like the limiting factor is not the program, or like something's wrong with the program. Limiting factor is my own preparation and my own effort once I'm in the gym, and like how hard I want to push a given accessory or a given lift, right? That's about it. It's not optimizing the program like is 3s or 4s going to be more, is doing tricep extensions today for sets of 8 or sets of 12 going to be more optimal. It's like, just don't focus on that, just focus on pushing as hard as you can, and then that'll get you where you're going to go in terms of like compounding this stimulus over time. But yeah, that's a good tangent. I think it's a good place to end off now that we're finishing up the programming talk. But to recap everything, generally across the board for most people, unless you're Dave, bench press is the one where you can recover a lot quicker in comparison to your squat and deadlift. So the advantages or implications of that is you could get away with training a lot more frequently. You could do a lot more within a given session. You could push it harder. But when you do factor all those things in, you might also need to consider using more variations, especially on those lower priority days. So you do get held back, and there's a very distinct difference between like a primary day that you want to push and a day where you're just trying to work on technique and aid in recovery. Yeah, I think that'll wrap things up. Thanks guys for listening, and we'll hear you guys, or you guys can listen to us in our deadlift programming episode. Take care.
you.